In the early 1900s, the North British Railway made a decision to build larger, more powerful locomotives, as they were competing against the likes of the Caledonian Railway. William Paton Reed, chief mechanical engineer of the NBR, was tasked with designing a locomotive more powerful than the railway's current fleet of 440s, and he did so, leading to the creation of the NBR Atlantics, or the 1913 classification of H. These 442s were the largest and most powerful locomotives on the North British Railway, but despite this, Reed was criticised for his engine, some saying it should have been a 460. Reed responded to this by saying its engines were intended for lines that were better suited for Atlantic types rather than 460s, such as the Edinburgh to Aberdeen main line and the Waverley route in the Border region, which were noted for their hills and their tight curves. When initially designing the H-Class, Reed had proposed a 3-cylinder compound, but the board of the NBR weren't fond of this idea, opting for a more standard 2-cylinder setup. These were approved, and in 1906, the first batch of 14 were ordered by the North British Locomotive Company in Glasgow. The Atlantics were different from most of the NBR's fleets in other ways than its size. They had a large boiler paired with a Belpaire firebox and external cylinders. When the first 14 members of the H-Class started work for the NBR, they proved to be troublesome in some respects. They were too big for most of the NBR's turntables. They also had some issues with oscillations, which was later investigated by Henry Ivatt of the Great Northern Railway. While the report Ivatt gave was alright, he did mention that the engine shouldn't be pushed beyond 55 miles an hour when descending steep slopes. Not satisfied with Ivatt's conclusions, the NBR asked Vincent Raven of the North Eastern Railway to do the same thing Ivatt had done. This time, Raven apparently praised the engine much more than Ivatt, only recommended minor changes to the blast pipes and piston valves. Over the course of 15 years, 8 more NBR Atlantics were built, 6 in 1911 by Robert Stephensons of Newcastle, and 2 in 1921 again by North British. 2 years later, the NBR was merged into the LNER. The LNER trialled the H-Class, now classified C11, against the C1s and C7s. They performed adequately, but when the new Gresley A1s came into play, the C11s were put on the sidelines, being used as backouts for the new Gresley Pacifics. Come 1933, the LNER decided to begin withdrawals of the engines, considering their aging boilers to be uneconomical to replace, with the Gresley A1s and P2s working the lines they'd previously been used for. By 1937, the entire class had been withdrawn from service. The LNER had decided to preserve number 9875 Midlothian in late 1937, but unfortunately, the engine had already been scrapped by the time the order to preserve it had been received. Thankfully, most of its parts were still intact, so it was rebuilt for preservation. Midlothian would then be returned to service and was later transferred to the LNER Railway Museum stock, which would later become the nucleus for the National Railway Museum. But only a few months after this transfer, Midlothian would fall victim to the Second World War, when, during the heavy demand for metal to produce wartime aircraft, it was scrapped for the necessity in 1939 for its parts to be used to build aeroplanes. All that remains of an NBR H-Class is the undercarriage of number 9879's tender, which was converted into a tanker wagon. It has been preserved. With all the talk of LNER engines like Mallard and Flying Scotsman online, I find it sad that very few people were talking about this excellent example of railway preservation that was ruined by World War II. I like to think, one day, Midlothian will be rebuilt, and will once again patrol ex-North British lines, just like it used to. Until then, we can only imagine.